So hello, and welcome to this episode of SelfKind with me, Erica Webb, and my friend, my fellow HSP and partner in crime, actually. We're going to talk a little bit about that, but Matt Glover. Welcome, Matt.
Hi, Erica. Good to be here.
Yes, always lovely to have you. Matt has been on the podcast before. The last time you were here, we were talking about forest therapy, which was actually such a long time ago. I think we were in lockdown.
Was it really? Oh, my
I think
goodness.
so.
Okay, yep.
Yep, so a really long time ago. So it's good to have you back. I have brought Matt in today because, as I mentioned, Matt is a highly sensitive person. Matt is one of the people that reminds me of my high sensitivity regularly and reminds me that, that thing that I'm experiencing might have something to do with my high sensitivity. And I wanted to bring Matt in today because I've had a few questions around raising and supporting highly sensitive children. And highly sensitive teenagers, and particularly the male experience of being a highly sensitive person. And so that is not something that I can talk about, although I am raising two highly sensitive boys. So I wanted to bring Matt in to talk about this with me because I think together we will give a bigger, broader picture, which is something that we're actually hoping to do together a lot more often, to work in this highly sensitive person space a little bit more. So this is not the last time you're going to see Matt. So that was a big, long intro.
Was, yeah. Far out.
I can talk a lot as well. I know you can talk a lot. I can talk a lot too. So Matt is a highly sensitive person. He is a counsellor. He is a very well-respected person in this space. And so I'm super happy to have you here. So Matt, anything else you want to let us know about who you are before we dive in?
I also have two sons, both who are highly sensitive. Mine are a bit older than yours, of course. Mine are 21 and 19. And also my dad is highly sensitive. So it's been passed down through the male side of my family. I knew my grandfather, my dad's dad, but I don't remember whether he was highly sensitive or not. But it's certainly something that in the family that I grew up in was something that was very present.
Yes. Okay. That's very interesting information. I hope that we can weave a bit more of that in because I know that you, your sensitivity was, very present in your childhood. You've talked about this with me before. And it sounds like you had a lot of your sensitive needs met in some ways, a lot of time in nature and things like that, which I'm going to just say is not necessarily the norm. So we'll get into that a little bit. Yeah. So maybe the best place to start would be to talk a little bit about like how we know or figure out or suspect that we might have a highly sensitive child, a highly sensitive teenager, either that we're raising ourselves or that we're supporting in our lives. Because I think sometimes that question is obviously like the first question we want to answer is like, is that what this is? Because sometimes it could be confused for other things. So how, what do you want to say about how do we know that we're raising or supporting a highly sensitive younger person?
So it's usually something that we recognize after as parents, we've freaked out and thought it's all sorts of other things first. And so, do we need to get an assessment? We need to get this, need to get that. And I think it's largely because high sensitivity is not a disorder. And so those that work in the health fields where diagnoses are given, they're not trained to recognize this. They're looking for ADHD or bipolar or whatever it is that's a diagnosable condition. And so high sensitivity doesn't register on the radar unless they have done their own learning or professional development in that space. It's certainly not taught. And so I hear this story all the time in here that parents recognize that there's something going on with their child and they're a little bit different to most of the other kids around the place, automatically think there's something wrong and so start going to see health professionals or have assessments and things like that. But there's something in the back of their mind that says, I'm not sure that's right. The health professional said it could be this or it could be this or it could be this. And the parent, just something sits uncomfortable with them. And it's like, but I'm not sure it's ADHD or I'm not sure that it's this. Like I get why they're saying it, but it doesn't quite ring true. Like not enough boxes are ticked or there are other boxes that are not even considered. And so then that parent will do what all good parents do and turn to Dr. Google and try and find out what it can be. And that's usually the moment when that parent stumbles across high sensitivity somehow. And it's like, oh, that kind of makes sense. They sometimes recognize it in their own life, certainly recognize it and start to, read more widely and see it playing out in the life of their child. And then they'll send me an email or you an email or somebody like us that works in this space. And they'll say to me, oh, I think I'm going to need, 10 sessions or something like this to help work this out and deal with it. Generally, we'll have maybe one or two, and that's it. The first one is education around high sensitivity. Second one is how do we manage it? And then they just go away and be awesome. Really, that's what it comes down to when they recognise there's nothing actually wrong with their child or them, that it's the way that person's wired and just really requires a slight shift in the way that it's managed, a slight shift in lifestyle, then that's all that happens. That's all that needs to happen.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. See, I came across, I guess, my kids' high sensitivity in a slightly different way than that. So that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about how maybe someone would have gone down all those pathways first. We actually had the opposite scenario. So I always knew my kids were highly sensitive, and they're actually sensitive in very different ways. They're not particularly similar kids, but very different. They're very different in their sensitivity. One is much more emotionally sensitive, the other one far more sensory sensitive. And so I always just treated them like they were highly sensitive people. I didn't do that perfectly. I'm just going to put that out there. I did it very imperfectly a lot of the time because I also hadn't really nurtured my own sensitivity, particularly in the early days of motherhood. But we had the opposite. So we've, kind of gone the opposite way and gone, oh, maybe there was a need for assessment and gone that direction. So I just want to point out too that neurodivergence can coexist alongside high sensitivity. They're not mutually exclusive, but they're actually not the same thing either. So that's a good thing to point out. It is interesting. I think there's like two things. There's a lot of questions that I have, a lot of things for us to talk about, but two things that pop immediately to mind is like parenting as a highly sensitive person, which maybe that's like a whole other episode, because that's hard. Oh my God, that is really hard. That's been one of the trickiest things for me is like, how do I like deal with my own sensitivity and parent sensitive people? That is sometimes unbelievably difficult. But also, if you're not highly sensitive and parenting a sensitive person, there's also challenges there. So I know that, my listenership will be primarily highly sensitive people. And so we have this interplay between our sensitivity and our kids' sensitivity. That's not the main thing I want to talk about today, but I think it's worth maybe just touching on if you've got anything you want to say about that, because it's a big topic.
As in parenting?
Yeah.
Oh, look, it is huge. And in one sense, it doesn't matter whether your kids are highly sensitive or not. Being a highly sensitive parent is hard work.
Yeah.
Particularly if we are introverted, highly sensitive people, and solitude is that thing that restores us, and you just don't get it because there's little people everywhere all the time wanting something, and you just find yourself, zooming into that red zone where all you want to do is just run away.
Yep.
Even though your kids might be beautiful and all that sort of thing, they're just there. And then if you happen to be partnered as well, and again, doesn't matter whether they're highly sensitive or not, they're around too and might want something from you in terms of some company or whatever. And it's like, just leave me alone.
Where's my cave?
That's right. So it is a challenge. And I think that then sort of comes back to the idea of just changing the way that we do life a little bit.
Yeah.
And so making sure we build solitude, not only into our own life, but into the life of our family as well. And so there's an expectation that, for me, for instance, this time each day, Dad needs time outside to read his book or sit in the garden or whatever, just let him do it. He'll be back shortly. If there's an emergency, like if there's blood or fire, then yes, we can interrupt him. But otherwise, just don't go there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, I was just
you go.
Like most things when it comes to high sensitivity, just a slight shift in the way that we do life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we will loop around and have a bigger conversation about parenting, because we need to come back to that. And I mean, this is kind of a conversation about parenting, but I really want to talk more about, like, I guess, how we support kids. Because I think one of the things, so I want to tell a little personal story. So I grew up being very sensitive, obviously not knowing that I was highly sensitive, and really coming to believe that I was, like, not cut out for much in a lot of ways, like I was too sensitive for the world almost. And so I feel like I funneled myself almost somehow into a life that was very different than what I cognitively thought I wanted or should want, right? And so I think that this can be part of the challenge, is like, how do we support kids to see their sensitivity as something that can be a real gift, rather than in the culture that we live in, where it's maybe sensitive is not as admired as much as extroversion and strength in the other way that we think of strength. How do we support kids to find the gifts? How do we support kids to know that they are really capable even when the world feels overwhelming? And how do we do that without being like control freaks? Do you know what I mean?
You asked me an easier question than that.
No, I have no easy questions.
This is a good idea.
Matt is now regretting all of his life choices.
So high sensitivity, 20% of the population. Okay, so we're in the minority. And of that 20%, 70% are introverted. So if you're highly sensitive, quite likely that you're introverted or introverted tendencies. The world that we live in our Western culture, so here in Australia and other Western cultured countries, set up by, run by and caters for non-highly sensitive extroverted people. So schools and religious organisations and sporting groups and shopping centres and everything, it's all for extroverted, non-highly sensitive people. So in that sense, we will always grow up feeling like we don't fit, because none of those places are comfortable for us. And we see some of our peers, friends, family, and they just seem to launch into it and don't have any issue. They don't struggle at all, and in a sense seem to revel in it. So when we see that and realize that we can't do it, or it just exhausts us, we start to think that something is wrong with us, and that's where that goes eventually. So if we can recognize it in ourselves, or we do recognize it in our children, then creating that atmosphere or that culture within our family, within our home life, that caters to the strengths of the highly sensitive person and builds in those restorative spaces. So my childhood, quite different to yours. As I mentioned, my dad is highly sensitive. He, to this day, still does not have the language for that. My parents grew up in a time where they weren't able to be educated, so both left school at sort of 12 and 13 years old to work. Quite poor families, things like that, which is why we lived out in the middle of nowhere. But that suited me perfectly as a highly sensitive person, because there was no traffic noise, there was no nothing. It was kind of, at the time, out in the country. So lots of solitude, lots of peace and quiet, the noises of animals and things like that all around. And my playtime, my spare time, would be on my bike, riding down to the river, exploring just by myself most of the time. So the solitude and the nature was all there. So kind of by fluke, I had the childhood that catered to high sensitivity. And again, my parents didn't have the language for it, but I think Dad recognized in me something that was in him and allowed me to do those things. Now, of course, it was a different time. Saturday mornings I'd get on my bike and I'd ride an hour to the river and I would explore all day, and I had to be back before the streetlights were on. No mobile phones, no nothing. My parents had no idea where I was.
No Life 360.
No, not at all. And it's not that they didn't care, but that was just normal.
Yeah.
And so in a sense, what is quite abnormal now catered towards my high sensitivity beautifully back then, because I could have a whole day by myself out in nature and come back glowing. I'd had such a good day, So fast forward to now, and I'll just use my boys as an example. Both of them highly sensitive, similar to yours in different ways. My youngest one is far more outgoing, or perhaps a little bit more extroverted, though I wouldn't call him an extrovert. And my older one, quite introverted, quite highly sensitive. He is affected more by the sensory stuff as well as the emotional stuff. The younger one, mainly just the emotional stuff, excuse me. So I suppose, like my dad did with me, I was able to recognize that in my boys quite young. And so I've made a point, and still to this day, this is what we do at the end of our either work day or school day. Come home, we'll acknowledge each other's presence, but we give each other space for an hour or so. So we don't sit down, so tell me about your day. What did you do? Who did you talk to? That just drives us insane. It's like, I don't really want to know you right now. Just leave me alone. So we have that time where we just decompress from the day and start to restore our tank, recharge our introverted, highly sensitive battery. And then we'll engage after that. And that can be quite lovely. But of course, when we miss out on that, it can cause some problems. Let's just put it there. Mm-hmm. We'll get a bit antsy with each other, and all sorts of things happen. So there's that. And the other thing, so where we live now, it's not like where I grew up. It is suburbia, but it's right on the edge of suburbia, and there's lots of bushland and countryside and things like that around us. Plus, we've made a point of establishing our garden to be a place of peace as well. So you can just step outside the back door, and just be there with the colours and the aromas and the butterflies and the bees and the frogs and the birds and all that sort of thing, just in our backyard. And it's not uncommon for me to finish my work day and one or both of my boys are in different parts of the backyard, just out there, just being, recharging their tanks and things like that. So that's the best that we can do in terms of our environment, shaping it to suit the highly sensitive person. Now, I know that there are some families and some families that I'm related to that will have their TV on in the background all day, all the time, just to have, they almost talk about it as company. No, we don't do that. Our house is very quiet most of the time. So trying to keep a sense of calm there. We might burn some essential oils or something like that to have nice aromas in the house. As much as possible, make it a place of peace where, when we walk in the door, we can just decompress from the day. Now, it doesn't sound like much, but, it's quite easy to have house being, or home life being chaotic and noisy and rushed and things like that. But then all we're doing is draining our highly sensitive battery at home as well. So changing that, trying to be a little bit less busy or a little bit less rushed is really, really important. Now, I know full well that particularly when our children are younger and there's more than one of them and there's after-school activities and sport and music and all that sort of stuff, it can feel a bit crazy. But I would say to families, don't think you have to do all of that sort of stuff. Choose one or two, but it's okay to say no. It's okay to have a night at home or a day at home on the weekend and just potter around and draw or play your Lego, go for a walk, whatever. That can actually be better for you than more stuff, and being super busy every day of the week. How are we going so far? I forget what the question was now.
So did I. No, that's good. I think we're kind of talking about how do we support these kids not to see their sensitivity as a burden, I guess. And I think what I'm hearing and what you're saying is if you're attending to their sensitive needs, then they're not a burden. It's interesting, even as a highly sensitive person who is a mother, I have definitely contributed to my children's overwhelm at times with that, quick, we got to get out the door, quick, you got to do this, quick, you got to do that. And I stop myself sometimes thinking how this makes you feel. It must be having a similar impact on them. Mm. And yet, like you say, it's just so easy to fall into that. It's remarkable how easy it is to fall into that as humans. And I think partly it's because we try to do too many things. But it's also, I think, for me anyway, trying to fit myself sometimes into a way that I see other people do things and being other people seem to be able to get there on time or do this or do that or do that. And so it's there's got to be something in there maybe about comparing either our highly sensitive kids and teens or even ourselves as highly sensitive parents and be like, well, we're not like that. You know, we aren't going to show up in the same way because it's just not who we are.
Mm. Yep,
yeah,
absolutely. With clients of mine that are children or teenagers, and I did with my kids when they were younger, I spoke about their high sensitivity as a superpower. So, it's something that you have that other people don't. And it means that you can see the world differently and experience the world differently and sense things at a much deeper level. So, yes, when there's a strong emotion there like sadness or anger, we'll feel that and it feels a bit yuck. But also when the sun shines and the sky is blue, we will experience a joy that other people might miss out on. Or we see the bee collecting pollen from the lavender. There's something that we can sit and watch and appreciate the beauty of. We can connect deeply with music and the arts and things like that, and we can express it in a way that others can't as well. So my oldest son is a musician. That's his chosen career. He loves being in the studio for hours on end, just in the same way that I used to be down at the river, and he's creating his music. And there's something about what he does now. I know I'm very biased because he's my son. But there's something about what he does that differentiates it to other music in that you can almost feel the emotion coming through it. You can kind of sense what he was experiencing when he wrote that piece. And that's something a highly sensitive person does naturally.
Yeah.
Others
Yes.
are non-highly sensitive. I was going to say they have to manufacture it. That sounds a bit crass, but it doesn't come as naturally to them as it does to the highly sensitive person.
Yeah, and maybe the depth is just different, right? It's like sometimes I have to remind people that it's not like it's a different thing that we're experiencing. It's like, like all of these things, it's a spectrum of depth of feeling. So it's not that other people don't experience that. It's just that you're going to experience it on like amplification 100 instead of 20. That kind of leads me to another question that I've been asked that I think would be really helpful to talk about, this idea of like leaning into your strengths and finding fulfillment in the activities and the jobs that potentially we support our children to go after. I mean, highly sensitive children, like anybody in the world, can do whatever they like, but have you found that there is a difference in where people end up going?
To some extent, yes. But like you've just said, I don't think there's any job that a highly sensitive person can't do. They'll just do it differently to people that are not highly sensitive. The only career path that I do have a question about whether a highly sensitive person could do it is politician. I'm just not sure.
Interesting. I'd like to see one in
Yeah,
there.
look,
I think that would be very good for our world, but yes.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I think the former Prime Minister of New Zealand was a highly sensitive person. And
Agree.
she was quite awesome in the way that she said her, core value was kindness. That's the words of a highly sensitive person.
Yeah.
You haven't heard that from any Australian politician, no doubt. So anyway, we do it differently. And sometimes that difference is the way that we look after ourselves in that job. So it might be that we take our lunch break outside apart from everybody else 3 times a week, something like that, to recharge our batteries in the middle of the day, to give us the energy that we need to go through. We might not go straight home after the work day. We might go to the local park and just do a few laps under the trees or something like that to begin with. If there's a lot of people time in what we do, then like we're talking about before, that hour or so when we get home, we just have some solitude. So the way that we approach the job might be different to people that are non-highly sensitive, even though the way we do the job might be exactly the same. The sorts of jobs, we're drawn to people helping professions because we feel what other people feel. And when other people are feeling good, particularly when we've helped them feel good, then that makes us feel good as well. So we're drawn to people helping type professions. And that doesn't always mean healthcare, though it does a lot of the time. It can be teaching or accounting or anything like that, where you're helping people just with general life stuff. So there is a larger number of highly sensitive people in professions where there's assistance offered to other people.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Actually, that's one thing as I think about that in terms of, supporting kids and teens to kind of like find fulfillment in whatever career or even job, because I think the idea of a career these days is a little different than it used to be. If that was one thing I could instill in my kids, it would be this sense of like, go after something that makes you feel good about what you're contributing to the world, whether that's direct support to somebody else or whether it's, bringing joy in some form or whatever it is. It has to matter more to you, right, than it does to anybody on the outside. Like, it's not uncommon to hear stories of grown-ups who, when they were teenagers, were really pushed and funneled into a particular career that they didn't have any interest in. But, if I can be the doctor, if I can be the lawyer, if I can be, the number one partner in the firm, then that will make everybody happy. And I don't think that is really very healthy for any human, but I think for a highly sensitive person in particular, that can be just soul crushing, because if we don't feel like what we do matters, I mean, I've been there. It's horrible. I remember my corporate career was just like unbearable, actually. It was unbearable because I didn't really believe in what I was doing. And, it was like, I don't care about this salary. I actually can't be here. This doesn't work for me. So that would be like if I was giving one little hot tip to the world in supporting kids, like if they're super fascinated by something that, just lights them up, let them do that thing. Like, I think not having set expectations on how they use their gifts.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then give yourself that gift too, please.
Yeah. And look, our stories are very similar there. I did 5 years in the corporate world straight out of uni. And I don't know how I made it to the 5-year mark, but it was...
I was 5 years too. Maybe that's the magic number.
And I really had issues around making lots of money for shareholders I didn't know and didn't care about me.
Yeah.
Like,
I had that issue and the issue of, I actually didn't work corporate. It was like government and not for profit, but it wasn't that different. That and like dealing with other people's emotions, dealing with the bullying that was inevitable in the workplace, dealing with just so much icky kind of stuff that was happening kind of under the table. I just would have these like physical, visceral reactions. So that's something actually that could be really useful to talk about that I didn't pre-warn you about. But how do we help our kids and teens to know when their sensitivity is like being overwhelmed or burdened? Like I know for me, I would literally shake. I would sit in my office, or not, I didn't have an office. I would sit at my desk and I would like shake and feel sick and get like, like cold sweats and stuff. So I think, I don't know, do you think that there's some value? I mean, I think there is, but do you think there's some value in teaching our kids and teens how to read themselves in such a way that they've got the language to say, you know what, my sensitive system needs something from me right now?
That's it. Yes, this is the short answer to that. Encourage our children, our teens, to be curious about how their own high sensitivity works. So learning to read and recognize, things are elevating a little bit here, and associating that with something to do to help regulate themselves. So it's not always possible to remove yourself from a situation, but if you can, go and sit outside or switch everything off, put the phone away, do some solitude, some reading, whatever. Some breathing exercises if you happen to be stuck in a boardroom meeting or something like that. Yeah. Clenching and relaxing your muscles.
Or an exam, right, at uni or high school or something,
Yeah, I used to draw quite a lot. Not surprising there. And I wish I'd kept them, but all of my notebooks that I did my original degree in, my chemistry degree, the borders of every single page are just cartoon after cartoon after cartoon and patterns.
There's a little hint buried in there, wasn't there?
There was. And that's how I kept myself, one, regulated, but two, focused.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's still the same, but back then the lectures were 3 hours. And the lecture rooms were just not comfortable. And it was boring. So, it's like,
and so many people.
Yeah, there was hundreds of people in those lectures. So yeah, learning to recognize those things is really important. And it will be different for everybody. Like for me, I don't get the sweats or anything like that, but I get foggy head. I just can't focus on one thing. Even if I've only got one thing to do, I can't focus on it. So that's a sign to me that things are getting a little bit out of whack. Bigger things is it affects my sleep and energy levels and things like that. Even though, I know I have the energy, it's like walking down to the letterbox to empty to pick up the mail. So I can't do that. I don't have the energy for that. It's like, hang on. Yes, you do. You're not as young and fit as you used to be, but you've got enough energy to walk to the letterbox. So when I can recognize those sorts of things starting to sneak in, it's like, okay, I'm overwhelmed here. I need to take some time out.
Yeah. That makes me think too of maybe this is too much of a can of worms, but there's my understanding of the research is that there are increased rates of depression and anxiety sometimes amongst us HSPs. And sometimes that HSP overwhelm can feel an awful lot like that too, right? Like it can show up as anxiety. It can show up as a depressed mood. And so I think that would be the other thing I would say around our kids and teens is having that open dialogue to be able to sort of talk about the fact that like, yeah, I'm feeling really down or I'm feeling really anxious. So that doesn't have to be something that, is this thing that we have to kind of cover over because we're just trying to appear normal. Like if we can have those conversations with our younger people to say like, yeah, that sometimes you will, when you're overwhelmed, feel anxious. And if we need extra support for that, go and get it, right? Like not to ignore those things as though they're not real things.
Yeah, absolutely. Always acknowledging that our high sensitivity doesn't cause us to be depressed or doesn't cause us to be anxious, but often because, for instance, we might feel like we don't fit into our peer group or our school or something like that, that can lead to some depressed mood and things like that. So we've got to be really careful there that we don't inadvertently send the message to our young people that because you're highly sensitive, you're going to be depressed. One equals the other.
Absolutely, yes.
That's not the case. But we've got to be very aware of it and very cautious too, because it can follow very easily. Coming right back to where we started, because of that feeling that a lot of us carry at different times in that we just don't fit in, and that can lead to questions of purpose and meaning and all of those sort of deeper, almost existential type questions that can be hard for somebody that age, hard for anyone.
Yeah, which you're so right. That is they're just difficult questions for adults. So they're difficult questions for kids. It occurs to me too that growing up, I always had that feeling of being different, but I could never put my finger on why. Like from the outside, I was like, there's nothing different about me, like I was such a stereotypical kind of person in my community. There was nothing about me other than my accent because I was Canadian. There was nothing that really stood me out, but I felt so different all the time. And I think there's something around that too, like
absolutely.
How do we put language around I feel different when maybe to other people we don't appear different?
Yeah. I've got a thought. I'm just trying to put it into words here. It's something along the lines of I will feel different and I don't fit in. All of that sort of stuff will swim through our mind. But that doesn't mean that we can't excel in those spaces or that we can't do good things in those spaces. It's just recognition that we'll do it differently to other people.
Yeah.
And that we can actually say no to some things that everybody else is saying yes to. It's like, well, I don't want to do that. Giving ourselves permission to not thrust ourselves into an environment that we know is going to be overwhelming or overstimulating.
Which is so much easier to do, I think, when you're an adult.
Yeah, that's it.
That's hard to do when you're a teenager. It's hard to do when you're a child, but I think there's something about being a teenager that makes, that's hard. Like I remember parties and things just being so overwhelming, but I wasn't not going to go, know, like, which, I'm not raising teenagers yet. So I've only got my experience to go on with teenagers, But what about in terms of when we feel different and perhaps other people are picking up on our differences? And I'd be curious to hear about your perspective of this as, growing up male in the world.
Mm.
How about dealing with bullying, unkind, comments from other people when your sensitivity perhaps is really evident to the world? Maybe there's been tears in public, or maybe you are saying no, our kids are saying no to certain things that other kids are saying yes to, and it's creating this you are different, there's something weird about you. How do we help our kids and teenagers navigate that without kind of throwing their needs, their sensitivity, their identity away in the process? That's a big question.
It is. I was just thinking we're going to have to do a whole lot more podcasts on each of those things.
One question per podcast.
I will try and summarize that as best I can. Some people, not everybody, but some people will notice that there is a difference with the highly sensitive person. And they might say, they're sensitive or whatever. And the vast majority of people will not bully somebody else for that. In fact, usually a highly sensitive person is a lot kinder and a lot more generous with their being, their time and things like that, and can be quite liked by other people. It's like, I like to talk to Erica, or I like to hang out with Matt, or whatever. He's just a nice guy, a nice girl. So that would be more of the experience. But of course, from time to time, and teenagers are teenagers, kids are kids, there will be bullying that happens from time to time. Usually not bullying because somebody's highly sensitive, because most kids are not going to have the language for that, but they might pick on their clothing choices or something else. And then the highly sensitive person has to learn to navigate that. And that can be really, really tricky. And, dealing with bullies perhaps is a whole nother conversation. But how do we cope with the bullying, or how do we help our children cope with the bullying when we know they're highly sensitive? First thing right off the top is to control your own anger. Because my oldest was bullied at primary school, and I was furious. I can't tell you how angry I was with that whole thing. And the school wasn't doing enough, and the teachers weren't doing enough, and what's wrong with the parents of these other kids? I was really angry because there was injustice there for somebody that I love very deeply, that I would, sacrifice my own well-being for that of my children. So people threatening them, that was a big button pusher for me. And that's part of the high sensitivity as well. Remember, everything is magnified. So when there is anger or a sense of injustice, that's magnified as well. So it's tricky. And if it's in the school environment, whether we like it or not, generally we have to work with the schools to help overcome that, because we can't control the actions of other people, but they can work on setting up programs and structures and things like that. For the highly sensitive person, absolutely giving them a space to debrief what's being felt, to normalize what's being felt as well, and say, hey, yeah, you're right to feel like that, to give some ways of expressing that in a positive, constructive way, whether we need to go outside and scream or draw it out or write it out or have space to cry, whatever it is, allowing that to happen. And then coming up with some strategies around, what do we do when should the bullying happen again? Is there a teacher that we can go to, or a wellbeing person at school or something like that? Empowering them to do that and not feel like that they just have to take it on board themselves. Also, learning some of those cognitive techniques that can help offset some of the bullying stuff. So like body posture, holding your body in the power pose and things like that, that portrays a sense of confidence, which can sometimes, wrong foot a bully. It's like, oh, okay, Matt's just actually stepped forward rather than step back. What do I do with that?
Yeah.
So a little bit of training around that can be helpful. And also recognize you can hold your body in a power pose even if you do not feel it. They don't know that because they're not highly sensitive.
Yeah.
But even simple things like that can be really effective too. In association with everything that we just spoke about arranging our time, our home, our lifestyles to ensure that we're charging the highly sensitive battery as much as possible. So should our children find themselves in that situation, they're not entering into it on empty. They've actually got some charge there to deal with it.
Yeah. Which hopefully everybody listening is like joining the dots here and saying, oh yeah, that's for me too. Not, whether you've got kids, teenagers or not, whether you've got any in your life or not, all of this stuff applies to us as adults too. And I think even sometimes for some of us, if we weren't perhaps raised with our sensitivity honoured and respected, even to do some of that reparenting for ourselves as well. So that's worth considering too.
It's good.
There's so much more we could talk about, but I'm looking at the time and thinking maybe we cap it there, because we're going to do this again for sure. As I mentioned at the start, Matt and I are going to be doing a lot more work together in this sort of HSP space. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like, for full disclosure, but it's happening. So that's going to be exciting. So you can expect to see Matt's face a little bit more. But yeah, anything else you want to say, Matt? Anything that you think we've missed that you're like, well, if we don't say that in this episode, then we've really missed the whole point?
Look, actually there is one of the things that sometimes we forget when, we've recognized that we have a highly sensitive child and we put everything in place and, doing the best that we can to create a world that is good for the highly sensitive child and that it helps them manage the challenges that are there. I use the word challenges rather than weaknesses. That's just what it is. It's not a weakness. And then our child enters into adolescence and becomes a self-centered, arrogant teenager. And we think, oh my gosh, our highly sensitive children will still become teenagers and they'll still do all of that teenage stuff that goes with adolescence and raging hormones and things like that. And the temptation will be to think, well, they've grown out of their high sensitivity now, haven't they? It's like, no, they are still highly sensitive teenagers, but there is still the trying on of different identities to see what fits. They still need the solitude. They still need the quiet, all of those sorts of things. And they still need their parents to be there kind of as that safety net. Even if they are rude and they just talk with grunts now instead of the language that they used to use, they are still highly sensitive young people now and still need us to be there.
That's a very good point to make. My eldest is 12, so...
Yes, and I say now that my youngest is 19 and we've only got 6 months left of teenage years, you do get there.
Yeah. Do you know, I was such a good teenager. I never really did the thing.
I did, and then I felt really bad and I'd apologise afterwards.
Yes, and do you know, this is the thing I think. That's the other thing, right, is your sensitivity can show up in lots of different ways. And so it's not going to be the same for everyone. My sensitivity very much as a teenager showed up as be the good girl, make sure everybody's happy. There was a lot of people pleasing, a lot of perfectionism kind of in how my high sensitivity showed up. But that's not necessarily how it's going to show up for everybody. So that's the other thing, right, is like, it might not show up like your sensitivity either, in terms of you're their parent perhaps, or their, relative or support person. And you might also be highly sensitive, but their experience of their sensitivity is going to be theirs. And so the challenges, the gifts, they might be slightly different. That's something that I often have to remind myself with my kids. One of their sensitivities is much more like mine than the other. And so recognizing, this isn't the same. This isn't exactly, they're not these little carbon cutouts of me. So, still having that capacity to just meet the person.
Yep, it's good.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you, Matt. It's always a pleasure to chat.
Good to be here again.
We'll see you. Well, we will talk to you again soon.
Okay. Thanks, Erica.
Bye.